Welcome to Old Stonewall Farm, home of me, the accidental country pastor. Well, I cannot believe how my daisies have just really grown. I planted these 3 years ago, and I really thought that they weren't going to survive, but all of a sudden this year, I have been blessed with just a bounty of beautiful flowers. Well, it is so great to have you here today for worship with me. Welcome. Today we are going to talk about what it means to experience the abundance of God's grace, just the abundance of beauty that God so freely gives to us. And we'll be talking a lot about the imagery of a garden, of seeds being planted, and what does it mean to really have God's grace bloom in our lives. And so thank you for joining me here today. Let us begin our worship to a great and loving God. Well, I couldn't think of a better location here on the farm to bring you the word of God than in the shade underneath my apple tree. It is a hot, sunny day here in Vermont, and I never get a chance to sit underneath my apple tree. I'm not sure why. So I thought today would be a beautiful location to unpack a little bit more, unpack the parable that Jesus tells, the parable about the sower and the seeds and the soil. Now, it's one that you are probably familiar with. It's a great one to teach children and to act out. It's just a beautiful parable, and it seems very, very cut to the point. It just gets right to the point. You see, there's a sower, and he has a whole bunch of seeds, and he takes them and he scatters them, and some wind up in rocky ground, which means that there's really no depth in which the root can take hold. So what happens is the plant starts to grow, but there's nothing really to sustain it when the sun comes out, or birds can come and just scoop up the seeds. There's not much for it to really take root. And so the sower takes some more seeds and he scatters them, and it winds up in an area where there's a lot of thorns. And so the thorns just crowd out the seeds, and the seeds can't grow. But then the sower takes the seeds and scatters them and winds up in good soil. And they bloom, they take off, and there's a beautiful, beautiful crop harvest garden, just like my daisies, of just beautiful flowers and produce. We always think about this parable and we take it and we think, well, it's talking about me, and it's trying to ask me, what kind of soil am I? Am I going to be rocky and shallow and say, yes, I have faith, but when the trials and tribulations come, my faith just withers and there's nothing really, really strong enough to sustain me? Or am I like the thorny area in which the Word of God tries to reach me? That little Word of God, that seed, that nugget of wisdom, of hope, tries to reach me, but my life is so busy, being choked by all this busyness and responsibilities. My life is being choked by all these other messages that I'm hearing, that the Word of God, the seed, doesn't really have room to change me, to comfort me. Or am I good soil? I hear the Word of God, and the Word of God really enters my life and grows. We always take this parable to think about the seeds in the soil and ask ourselves, what kind of soil am I? But I want us to think about the sower, God. The sower represents God. And I find it very interesting that God, who is all-knowing, all-powerful, God takes these seeds and just throws them in a rocky area, or throws them in an area where there are thorns. I mean, God is smart. You think God would know better. I just say, well, no, my word is not going to bloom there. So I'm going to focus on the good soil. But God in His grace and mercy, He just doesn't focus on the good soil. He doesn't focus on those that He thinks deserves grace. God, the sower, is showing us in this parable that no matter what condition we are, no matter what condition God finds us in, when God throws out grace, He has hope. He has hope that the grace will still reach us. Even in the shallow soil, even in the thorny areas of life, the sower, God, takes the seeds and scatters them and has hope that His word will reach us no matter what condition God finds us in. And think about it. A friend of mine who lives in the city, New York City, had a picture that she sent to me. And on the busy city street, the sidewalk, all concrete, there was this crack, and not just one little flower growing. Sometimes you see that. But in this crack, in a city sidewalk where there's no soil, nothing around, was an abundance of all these beautiful purple flowers, like a cluster of purple flowers growing on a city sidewalk. And then I think about the thorny area and the weeds and everything that could just crowd out anything beautiful. Well, a few years ago, on the other side of my farm, there is this big boulder. And there was all these weeds growing up. And so I took it upon myself one day to take out all those weeds. I figured, I want to reveal this big boulder and maybe create kind of a rock garden. And so one day I went in there and I started ripping out all this overgrown like grass and weeds. And lo and behold, as I started to remove all the weeds, what I found were these beautiful yellow irises that were growing. I never knew they were there because the weeds just choked them out. But in spite of the weeds, those irises were still there blooming. And so the sower, God, maybe He is onto something. That He's going to take His word, He's going to take grace upon grace. And in spite of all the weeds and the thorns that could choke out something beautiful, God still sprinkles it, knowing that, my word is powerful and something beautiful can still grow in the busyness. God still takes the seed and throws it into shallow ground, a concrete sidewalk in the city, and God's grace and beauty can still break through. And so this parable of the sower and the seeds, it's more about than just asking us, what kind of soil are we? It's about looking at the sower himself and how generous this sower is with these seeds of grace. Now, when the people in Jesus' time first heard Jesus tell this story, they were probably shocked. You see, Jesus spent most of His ministry preaching in the rural countryside, not the cities. And so He's in the rural countryside where there are probably a lot of farmers. And so when they heard this parable for the first time, I don't think they were first analyzing, well, what kind of soil are we? I think they were thinking, oh my gosh, why is this farmer wasting all these seeds? This farmer should know better. You just don't throw seeds into thorny areas or shallow ground. But in that message, Jesus was trying to say, God doesn't give up on you. And God doesn't give up on that person next to you. God doesn't give up on anyone. God doesn't judge what kind of soil you are. And so we shouldn't judge another person at all. God's grace is poured out everywhere and upon everyone. You see, the sower knows that something can grow, something can take root, no matter who the person is, what that person is going through. God's grace can reach us and change us. I think I'm like the 1,000 person who is on the Hamilton kick, on Hamilton, the Broadway show. Disney made a movie out of it, and it was released July 3rd. And I got to watch it finally. I love history. But there's this one song in the Hamilton musical that really just reached deep into my heart. There's a scene in which Alexander Hamilton, Eliza, his wife, and him, they just lost their son, Philip. He was killed in a duel. So they lose their son. They're mourning and grieving their son. Alexander Hamilton also had a scandalous affair, probably the first affair in the new country. And so that kind of put a rift in the marriage. And so here you have Alexander and Eliza going through so much. And it is Eliza's sister who sings the song. And there's one line in which she looks at Eliza and Alexander, who are supposed to be in a garden, and they're grieving. There's a lot of sadness, a lot of uncertainty. And Eliza's sister sings this one line that I find so beautiful. She says that there is a grace too powerful to name. There's a grace too powerful to name. And we wind up pushing away the unimaginable. We wind up pushing away what can be because we just can't comprehend that there's a grace so powerful out there that it can change our lives. There's a grace too powerful to name. And so when I think about that song, I think about the sower and the seeds in the soil. I think about that sower just being so generous with grace, pouring it out, knowing that no matter what the condition we are in, God's grace can still reach us. There is a grace too powerful to name, but it's a grace that is powerful enough to take root in our lives and to change us, to forgive us, to give us hope again. There's a grace too powerful to name, and that sower, God, is reaching deep into his bag of grace, and he's pouring it out abundantly onto all of us. And so, my friends, it doesn't matter what soil you are. It really doesn't. Because God's grace can indeed reach us. And so I ask for you today and in the days to come to really imagine God pouring out his grace upon you. And that grace taking root, changing you, and leading you to a beautiful, beautiful abundance of peace, of love, of certainty that you are not alone. God doesn't judge the condition that this world is in, that we are in. God doesn't just seek out the good soil, the good people, the talented people. God looks at the rough places, the desolate places, the hurting people, the broken people, the lonely people, the sinful people. And God reaches in with grace upon grace, and we can receive it.